Good morning. This is Lauren Peretti from Housing Innovations. Thanks so much for joining us. So I'm here today with Alice Minervino at DMHAS, and Alice and I are going to be leading today's webinar on the DMHAS CoC Rental Assistance Operations Guide. So before we get started, just quick, in case anybody's new, and just a quick introduction. So Housing Innovations, we are the consultants to the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care, and also consultants to DMHAS, and we actually helped DMHAS to write the CoC Rental Assistance Operations Guide. And I've been with Housing Innovations for about 6 years and have been involved in the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care since I think about 1999, so a long time now. Alice, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. This is Alice Minervino. I think looking at the attendees, most of you know who I am, but for those of you who don't, I work at the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services and the Housing and Homeless Services Unit, and we are the grantee. DMHAS is a grantee for approximately 52 grants from HUD, and so you know, rental assistance is a big part of what we do. So I do want to thank Lauren and the team at Housing Innovations and our team in the Housing and Homeless Services Unit for putting this rental assistance operation guide together, and thank Housing Innovations for putting the webinar together.
Thanks, Alice. So before we get started, I just want to do a couple housekeeping things. So first of all, because we are expecting a pretty big crowd today, we have muted all of the lines for you guys that are participating, because otherwise there will be a lot of background noise on the webinar. So we're sorry about that. If we have time at the end, we've got 2 hours together, so we're scheduled to finish at noon. We've got a lot of content to cover, so I'm not sure that we will have time on the end, and we definitely are committed to getting everyone off right at noon because we know you are busy. If we have time at the end, for people that would like to stay on, we will open up the line so you can ask questions orally. In the meantime, during the presentation today, there's a Q&A feature. It should be located in the ribbon at the bottom of your screen, and if you click on that, you can ask a question, and we will answer the question either out loud or through the text in the Q&A feature. There's also a feature there where there's like a little thumbs up. So if someone asks a question that you also think is a burning question, you can use that thumbs up feature to let us know, and then that way we'll, if we know that several people have the same question, we'll try to prioritize getting it answered. Of course, as always, if you do not get your question answered today, please feel free to call me or call Alice, and we'll be sure to get all of your questions answered. We are also recording this webinar today, so if you've got folks on your team who were not able to join and they would like to watch the webinar, after today it will be posted to the CT Boss website, and anybody can watch it there. And then finally, we will be doing an evaluation. We'll send out an evaluation to you guys via SurveyMonkey after today. So we always really encourage people to respond to those. We do incorporate ideas that you give us. Every time we do an evaluation, somebody has a great idea, and we really do try to incorporate those. So please take a few minutes. It's short, I promise, and give us that important feedback. And then also, we apologize in advance. We're hoping that the tech works seamlessly today, but there's always the chance that it does not. So we apologize in advance for any technical any technical issues that arise during the call today. All right. So here's our agenda for today. Today is not intended to be an in-depth compliance training. We only have 2 hours, so it's not possible for us to go through. For those of you who've been around a while, you know that there are many rules associated with the CoC program. We are certainly not going to cover all of those rules today. So really what we're going to focus on is the things that are new, the requirements that were newly established when the DMHAS CoC operations guide was released. And then also the things that when we go out and monitor or based upon the questions that we get seem to be continued areas of confusion, even though they're not necessarily new requirements. So we've got a mixed crowd with us here today, folks who've been around forever and could probably lead this webinar, and folks that are newer. And so we apologize to those of you who are old hats at this, because we are likely to cover some stuff that you guys already know. I know there's one other thing I want to say. So another thing just to keep in mind, especially if you're newer, there are comprehensive compliance training materials on the CT-BOSS website. So if you've not been to those trainings before, you might want to go to the website and take a look. There's a webinar that we recently did that goes much more in depth on monitoring than what we're going to cover today. There is a training, there's slides, it's not a webinar, but there is a full training just on environmental review, as well as an FAQ on environmental review. There's full trainings just on the fiscal requirements, including one that's just about project admin and indirect, which is a constant source of confusion and not something that we're going to talk about today. There are also full trainings on the service requirements for the CT-BOSS CoC programs and for the housing coordination components, the housing coordination requirements for those projects. So please answer questions that are not answered today. Check out those materials, and as I said, we are always happy to answer your questions by phone. So we're going to start with just a quick welcome and introduction of the folks that are on the line. Alice is going to talk a little bit about the operations guide and the background on what the guide is and why we did the guide. Alice is also going to talk a little bit about who the key partners are. So these are pretty complicated projects sometimes, and she's going to talk about who the key partners are and what their roles and responsibilities are. We know that one of the key things of making any kind of project that involves partners work is for all of the partners to be clear about roles and responsibilities and who's responsible for what. So we're going to spend some time on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the new requirements in the guide, and then other notable requirements where we sometimes see confusion. We're going to talk very briefly about monitoring, and then we're going to make sure you guys have information about where you can find more resources. And then, as I said, if we have time, we will open up the line for questions and answers and send out the survey so that you guys can give us any suggestions for how to make it better next time. All right, so first we're going to start with a little Zoom poll here. We're going to use these throughout the presentation today to give you guys a chance to give us some information. So the first one we have is, what role do you play in the CoC? And you can choose more than one answer. So this is just helpful for us to know who's, and for you guys to know who's on today. So we'll give you a minute to do that, and then we will share the results. All right. So it looks like we've got about half of the people on the call today, or on the webinar today, are supervising folks that provide direct service. About a third of the people either are providing or supervising housing coordination services. So that would include, but maybe not be limited to, our LMHA staff, who play a super critical role, and we're going to talk about that important role today. We've got a handful of folks that are direct service folks, case managers and the like, a handful of fiscal folks, a handful of folks that work at government agencies, and some folks that don't fit into any of those categories. And I just want to say that every single role here is absolutely essential to making these projects work. for helping people to get out of homelessness quickly and stay housed. And so we are really glad to see that, you know, so many different people playing different roles have joined today, and we thank you for being with us today. All right. So, Alice, I think you were going to pick up here.
Yes. So I wanted to do a little bit of background on the reason that we have worked to implement or to create the guide. For those of you who come to some of our regular meetings throughout the state, we've talked about the state auditors coming to look at and audit the HUD program. So a lot of you have been sending us information related to the tenant's eligibility, income, rent reasonableness, those types of things. One of the recommendations of the state auditors was to create a more expansive operations guide. We had the administrative guide, but they really wanted something that was sort of, excuse me, soup to nuts about the running the program. So we did work with Housing Innovations and to create this guide. It was released in October of 2019 after felt like a very long time and many, many versions to make sure that we were getting everything correct. It does replace the old administrative plan and it establishes the standard concepts, definitions, policies, and procedures. One of the things we always say at DMHAS is, you know, our documents are living documents, and so while we hope to not have to make large, substantial changes to this operations guide, as things change or HUD makes different recommendations or different guidelines, that we will need to update the policies of the operations guide. So, you know, this is a great starting point, but there are things over time, as we all know, things change. So we'll keep this updated. And it also covers all of the different types of projects that rental assistance covers. So the scattered site or tenant-based vouchers, the sponsor-based vouchers, and the project-based vouchers. Lauren, can you click to the next slide for me?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking, but I neglected to unmute myself. I just wanted to say really quickly, if you guys have suggestions for how the guide can be more helpful to you, please let me or Alex know. We do want not just to have the guide serve as meeting the, you know, the auditor's needs, but also, of course, be a helpful resource for you guys. So please let us know if there are ways in which it can be more helpful. All right.
So today our target audience really is the folks who administer or work in the rental assistance programs. So the LMHA staff or the DMHAS funded nonprofit staff who either administer the continuum of care rental assistance, provide the housing coordination, or provide any support services. As you know, we contract with private nonprofit agencies to provide the support services. And in some cases, we work with private nonprofits who do the housing administration. So this, and in some cases, that's the same agency. So, you know, this is really a guide for everyone who kind of does any work around the rental assistance programs statewide, the HUD-funded rental assistance programs. We're going to look at best practices and stuff that's helpful to other folks working in the project. Go back, look at our little ants, they're so cute. And everyone has a responsibility in this work. Everyone has we have different partnerships. And so our partner responsibilities are a little bit different depending on which entity you're working on or working with. So project participants, they need to provide information to us. So HUD requires annually updated income from every person. We need to know the family composition, and we need to make sure that people are eligible for the program. So as you probably know, HUD requires people that need to be homeless and have a disabling condition, and they need to meet an income eligibility. So HUD requires income verification annually and an inspection of the apartment annually. People have to live in a qualified unit. So that means that it needs to meet a rent reasonableness standard. It needs to pass a housing HQS, which is quality standards. And it's really important for those of you who are doing housing coordination and doing the housing quality assurance forms to really make sure that the person is living in a place that it meets those standards. The tenant is the person who finds the apartment for themselves. You know, our support staff and the housing staff can help people if they know of things, but they really should not be the ones picking out apartments for people. People need to comply with the lease, so they need to pay their portion of the rent on time. They need to maintain, you know, a level of peace and calming for the other residents. They shouldn't have people who are in the apartment that aren't on the lease, or they can't sublease an apartment. They need to maintain the apartment in cleanliness. They have to have their utilities on to make sure that that meets the housing, the HQS. This should be their primary residence. Again, they cannot sublet. And people should notify their housing and service provider if there are things that are impacting their tenancy. Anything that could be impacting their tenancy should be discussed. And they cannot, they have to maintain a respectful and nonviolent behavior to their tenants, the other tenants, the landlords, the service provider, the housing provider. That's just part of being a good tenant. DMHAS's Office of the Commissioner of the Housing and Homeless Services Unit. There are 4 of us that work in that unit. Many of you know Nichelle Jefferson, who processes all of the paperwork and information that you guys send up to our office. Lisa Callahan, Brenda Earl, and myself really do a lot of the oversight and making sure that things are compliant and maintaining our eligibility with HUD. We work with other partners, the folks at the housing staff, the supportive services staff, and then other state and advocacy groups throughout. We provide training and technical assistance, just as we are doing today. We oversee the project performance and our expenditure report, our expenditures, so that hopefully we're not underspending too much and we're not overspending too much. And we also are responsible to submit the APRs to HUD, the annual performance reports. As I said earlier, we work with the Department of Housing. Particularly, you guys work a lot with the coordinated access networks. So this is the map of the original 8 cans, and currently the eastern can is the pink and the yellow are all now 1. The lighter pink and the yellow are all 1. So there are 7 cans that you guys work with, and that's to ensure that people have access to the housing. People are assessed for their needs. Their eligibility is determined through that. You can prioritize assistance. The referrals are made to programs and services, and it really establishes a coordinated entry. This was something HUD really mandated a few years back, and so they want everyone to be able to have the equal access to getting housing. And so rather than having a person have to fill out several applications or go to several places or hoping that they have a case manager that knows about all the housing opportunities, this really opened the door for people being able to have one application cover many, many different options for them. So our other key partners are actually all of you on the phone. So our housing providers, whether you're a state-operated local mental health authority, a nonprofit agency, You guys as housing providers do the on-the-ground work, and we are so appreciative of that. You work with the clients, you work with the tenants, you do the inspections, you do all of our paperwork and make sure that we do all of the things that HUD asks us to do, and while entering data into HMIS and helping us with the annual performance reports. And so for that, we really, you guys are really key partners. The service providers are also really important. They provide the in-the-home services or in the community services to the participants, really helping to maintain relationships with landlords, their other tenants, the housing provider, any community supports that they might have. So again, you guys are essential to helping us have an outstanding program throughout the state. And sometimes, in some cases, a single agency may serve as the housing provider and the service provider. And so those two roles are very different. And so most agencies have two different entities that do different things. So the housing work is one aspect, and the case management is the other aspect. It's really essential that those are two separate services that people are getting, or two separate services isn't necessarily the right word, but two separate tasks that people are giving, so that the waters don't get muddied and blurred over what role you're playing at that time. So as I said, housing providers might be a state-operated local mental health authority. There are 6 in Connecticut. And then we also have DMHAS-funded nonprofit agencies that provide housing services. Those are often the non-state operated, the private nonprofit operated LMHAs, but they're also private nonprofit agencies. Your job is to make sure that you notify the CANs when there's an opening or an anticipated opening. Your job is to administer the rental assistance, so work on the leases, the contracts, the rent calculations, the rent reasonableness. The rent reasonableness is a very important form. I probably will mention this, and Lauren may mention it several times during the training. It is one of the things that HUD requires, and we have to have 3 rent reasonableness for each apartment that someone is renting. And it helps ensure that people are living in appropriate places. And housing providers can help ensure services. In that way, they can, if someone is in need of services, they might be able to work with the other providers in the coordinated access network, or CAN, to refer them to that. If there's service provision attached to the grant, they can help facilitate the person getting referred to the services. If there's community services the person wants, the housing coordinator may be able to refer them to those. Our service providers, what we really expect and appreciate is the assertive engagement. Working with people where they are, in the community, in their home. We know that at times people can not want services or be reluctant to accept services, and the service providers that we work with are amazing at trying different techniques to engage people and really help them with assessments of what their needs are, helping to stabilize their housing, create service plans, home visits, which I said. Our service providers work with people on increasing their income, whether that's applying for Social Security benefits or employment, or any other benefits they might be eligible for, or employment that they're interested, and really helping to maximize people's independence and really become more involved in their community. And finally, and last but certainly not least, is entering the HMIS data in a timely and accurate fashion. The HMIS data helps us in many ways, one of which is the annual performance reports that are submitted to HUD. And it's really important to have the best and most accurate information presented to HUD. One of the things we recently have done is ask that providers enter their monthly rental payments so that we can determine how much of the grant we're spending every month, so that we are not, again, overspending or underspending. If we're overspending, we try to mediate that so we don't go into the red at the end of the year. But if we're underspending, is there a way we can use some of that extra funding to maybe house another individual or family? So the joint responsibilities, I think you guys probably know very well what your joint responsibilities are, but they're to help the participants navigate the CAN process, which although much more streamlined than our old ways, still can have its hiccups. And so it's really helpful to have someone who knows the system and knows how to navigate it, help our folks. Make final eligibility determinations. So again, HUD requires that a person is experiencing homelessness and has a disabling condition. Those are two incredibly important documents that need to be completed accurately for admission into the program. And our state auditors, when they come and do an audit, those are two of the very important documents they look at. People can, either the housing coordinator or the service provider, again, can help people if they're looking for an apartment, giving them some leads. Maintain participant files and financial records. We've talked about that. I know you guys, every year when the auditors come, Lisa Callahan asks for a lot of information. We're having some of that uploaded into HMIS or sent to us prior to. But it is important that those files are maintained. You have to make sure that you're spending the continuum of care funds appropriately. HUD will look at that, and if there's inappropriate spending, it could be a recapture risk. Coordinate with other participants and service providers, property owners, landlords, CANs. Our unit, we know you guys really, really well. It's awesome. Sometimes the phone number will pop up on my phone and I know exactly who it is before I even answer. And I'm sure when I call, you guys know it's my phone number. So that's really great to have that kind of constant communication. Please, it's really important to confirm the APR data prior to it being due to HUD. I know I've talked about running your data quarterly just to make sure that it's accurate. It's harder to, we have a time frame to get the APR to HUD after the close of a grant. And so for those grants that are really large, finding the errors is very time consuming. So it does help if you review along the way. And then, submit your required information to the continuum of care or DMHAS. And so you guys are really great at that. Sometimes I know we have tight turnarounds or multiple asks, but everyone is so great at getting us the information we need. And lastly, some of our other key partners are the landlords and property managers. We have congregate sites, we have scattered sites, and really the landlords are one of our strongest partners. They rent to our tenants, but they have responsibilities too. They need to comply with the lease. They need to, DMHAS has a lease that we require to sign because there's nothing in it that is discriminatory. Our contract needs to be signed so that they have a standing contract with the state of Connecticut so they can get paid. They need to maintain the apartment up to the HQS standards. They need to comply with federal, state, and local laws regarding fair housing and non-discrimination. They need to comply with the provisions of the Violence Against Women Act. And we've had a couple of instances where we've had to implement some of the VAWA, or Violence Against Women Act. And the landlords were really, you know, understanding and really great about doing it. So that was helpful. They have a responsibility to report tenancy issues. They have a responsibility to report vacancies. And this is really important for a lot of reasons. We want to make sure that, you know, we're renting to the right people and people are still in the apartment. And then they comply with Connecticut housing owner and tenant law. So I'm going to let Lauren take it over for a little bit.
Hi guys. So I'm going to talk about some new, the new requirements that were instituted through the guide, and again, some of the things where we continue to see some ongoing confusion, even though maybe the requirement isn't totally new. So the first thing I wanted to just say is that this is the link available here on this slide, both to where you can find the full operations guide that we're talking about today, as well as where you can find all of the forms that DMHAS requires for all of their CoC rental assistance projects. And I'll say just in what we find in the field and monitoring is that generally the LMHAs, the state-run LMHAs, right, are super familiar with the forms and for the most part using the forms, and that some of the nonprofit housing coordination, the nonprofit LMHAs are maybe not as familiar with the forms. So everybody that's running a DMHAS CoC rental assistance project is required to use those forms. And so if you haven't been to this link, please go there. I just wanted to say that we totally get that, like, forms are like cats, right? They have 9 lives. So, you know, I don't know what it is, but I've had many experiences over the course of my career where a form is out of date, and I think I've finally been able to retire it from our system so that no one is any longer using it, and then suddenly, miraculously, a year later, it pops back up in charts. So we get that ongoing challenge. I think one good way to try to overcome that challenge, we certainly try to help during monitoring. When we see that you're using outdated forms, we try to let you know that. And then also, it's probably a good idea periodically just to visit this link and download all the most recent versions to make sure that you're using the most recent versions. We will send out emails when Alice and Lisa and their team send us updated forms. You'll know that they've been updated on the website. Okay. So I am not going to go. Alice already talked quite a bit about some of the service, things that we expect, that DMHAS expects from the service providers in these projects. Today is not meant to be a best practice in services training, so I'm not going to go through all of these things. I will say that if there's anything here that you're not sure what it means, please go in and look at the guide. There's a section in the guide on all of the supportive service requirements, and so each of these things is described in more detail in the guide. Again, not going to go through all of these things, but just wanted to say quickly one thing that we often see some lingering confusion about is that even though this is a Housing First program, right, that does not mean that when someone says, thanks but no thanks, I'm not interested in services, that you as the service provider stop trying, right? So folks have probably heard our team at Housing Innovation say before that in Housing First, services are voluntary for the tenants, not the staff. And so what that means is that even when someone says they're not interested, you continue to try to engage. And often the best way to engage, of course, is to offer them things that they want, and sometimes, especially in the beginning, material things that are very concrete, like new sheets, a turkey for the holidays, etc. And I have to say, when we go out and we monitor, we see, as Alice said, lots of creative ways to engage some very reluctant tenants. We do sometimes see confusion, though, about what is voluntary and what is not. So I just want to say that the things that Alice talked about before on the participants' responsibilities, right? Things like allowing somebody into the unit for HQS, signing the lease, giving you income documentation, right? Participating in that annual research process is not voluntary. That is required. Now, if you've got somebody that's, maybe has some paranoia or other mental health challenges, for them to participate in that process, by all means, You should do whatever kind of reasonable accommodation is necessary to enable them to effectively participate, but you cannot waive those requirements. Those are HUD requirements. All right. So real quickly, wanted to talk a little bit about some of the very specific things that are required in the guide. So, and to say that these things are required for projects where there is a designated service provider on the project. So we do have a handful probably of projects across the state where there is no designated service provider, meaning there is no DMHAS contract, either CoC funds or other DMHAS funds with a nonprofit that says that that nonprofit is responsible for providing services to the participants in that project. So these things apply only where there is a designated service provider. We're going to talk in a minute about the things that apply where there is no designated service provider. So the first one is needs assessment. So DMHAS requires that you do a needs assessment at least every 6 months. There's a form, the CSH form is available on the CSH website. DMHAS also requires that you are doing service planning with the tenants and that those service plans are updated at least every 6 months and that the initial service plan is completed within 60 days of project entry, right? We are looking for goals that are specific and measurable and indicate who is responsible for each action and when those actions will occur. Right, so rather than saying the goal is to get a job, right, and that's it, right, we look for goals that say, yeah, okay, the goal is to get a job, but then it's go much more specific than that, right? For example, the case manager is going to, you know, help the client to look at a number of online resources every 2 weeks for the next month to figure out what openings they want to apply to. The client is going to select 3 openings that they're going to submit an application for, and the case manager's going to help with those applications within the next 2 months. That would be an example of the kind of specificity that we're looking for in those service plans. The service plans need to be signed by the case manager, the participant, and the supervisor. We do not want to see service plans that have the same goals for all of the participants, right? So even if there's some commonalities, like a lot of your people might have the goal of wanting more money, right? The specifics about how they're going to get there and what that means to them, right, are going to be individual for each person. So we don't want to see when we come in and we look at 5 charts that every chart has the same identical goal that's just being cut and pasted from one chart to the next. We also look to make sure that the case notes are consistently showing that the staff are providing assistance and helping the client to achieve goals and objectives. So that doesn't mean that necessarily every single time you see the client, you have to do that. But, you know, if we look at notes for 6 months, we want to see, you know, periodically, right, at least you're providing services that are aligned with the service plan goals, or you've documented that the client maybe has decided they no longer want to work on that thing, and that's fine too. And then again, service planning is voluntary for the participants, but not for the staff. So if you've got people that don't want to participate, just document your attempts to engage them. All right, so here are the requirements for when there is no designated service provider. So I think these are all LMHA projects, you know, state-run LMHA projects, and Alice will correct me if I'm wrong about that, where there isn't a nonprofit that's contracted by DMHAS to provide services for the site. And so in that case, right, what DMHAS is looking for is that the LMHA is keeping track of which participants are engaged with a case manager and maintaining current contact information for that case manager in the participant chart, right? And the idea here is because you want to know, right, the housing coordination staff are going to often be the first people that know that there's a problem, right? Because the landlord's going to call you or the tenant's going to call you. And so you want to know, like, when you know, that landlord tells us, hey, this guy hasn't paid their rent in 6 months, right, that you know who the case manager is and you can contact them so that the case manager can help the client to resolve the problem and comply with the lease. And so when you do that, right, when you make that call to the case manager, just document it in the chart. Just make a quick note in the chart that says you made the call on such and such a day to alert the case manager and do some coordination to try and make sure that there were some services in place that keep the person stable in housing. The other important thing is that, so you'll have a list, right? Here's all the people in the project. Here's everybody's case manager, and then here are the people who are not already engaged with a case manager, because we know there are people in those projects that are not engaged with a case manager. And I just want to say that this program, the Permanent Supportive Housing Program, from HUD's perspective, it's not just an affordable housing program, right? It's not meant to be just a subsidy for folks. So, so we really do have to show a sort of attempt at least to engage people in case management, even if they decline it, because it is housing first, they can decline, but we are responsible for documenting attempts to engage people in case management. And so DMHAS, I think newly in the guide made this very clear, like what that requirement is. And so we're going to be looking for, when we come out and monitor, if there is no designated case manager, that the housing coordination staff made at least two attempts in a year, approximately every 6 months, to connect that person to case management. So that can happen initially when you first, someone first enters the program. It can happen each year face-to-face, because you're seeing the clients each year face-to-face annually. And then it should happen at least one other time during the year. And it might happen when there's a crisis, right? That's always, unfortunately, a good time to engage someone. It might be, and how you do this is really up to each individual LMHA, depending upon the resources that you have and what you think makes sense for your project. It might be by phone, it might be by text, it might be by a letter. Maybe you've got resources to be able to do it face-to-face twice a year, which I think is probably ideal if you can make it happen. Okay. So these are the other things that the LMHA is responsible for when there is no designated service provider. Again, this is a HUD requirement, right? So making sure that there is an annual assessment of service needs, that is a HUD requirement. And we absolutely get that the LMHAs do not have the resources to be able to do that. I don't remember how many pages it is, but let's say 20 some odd pages of the CSH assessment. So what we did is HI worked this year with DMHAS, and we developed a very brief 2-page assessment that's intended for the LMHAs to use when there is no service provider. So you need to do that assessment not twice a year, but once a year at least, although twice a year is great if you can do it. And probably the time that it makes sense to do it is when you see people at, initially when they rent the unit, and then again at research. That form also enables you to document not just what the needs are, but what you did in response to the needs. So what referrals you made. So it kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone in that way of meeting the requirements. They also, I mean, the spirit here is that there's coordination happening, right? Alex talked before about how essential both of the roles of the housing coordination and service provider are for helping people to stay safe and stable in their housing. And so the idea here is that that coordination is happening even when there isn't a designated service provider, right? So some of the people in the program are going to have case management, some are not. Where there is a case manager, the housing coordinator should try to get a copy of the service plan so everybody knows what everyone else is working on. It isn't so siloed, and all of the things that are in that service plan can be also reinforced by that housing coordination team whenever there's an opportunity. So maintaining that copy of the service plan, maintaining a copy of the assessment, and then again, making a sort of attempt to engage participants in services that are identified as being needed. All right. There are a couple projects, a handful of projects maybe across the state where there's more than one designated service provider. And so in that case, what we'll be looking for is that the housing provider, the LMHA, I think these again are all LMHA projects, is responsible for ensuring that each participant is referred to one of the service providers, and then that service provider, so it's clear who is responsible for that participant. Even if they're not engaged necessarily, that's the service provider that's responsible for encouraging that engagement and that participation again, so that there's no confusion and that none of the clients end up just with no one trying to engage them because everybody thought someone else was doing it. Okay, switch gears quickly and talk about moving on. So just in case people are new and aren't familiar with the concept, so the idea of moving on is that when folks who are living in PSH are stable and no longer need the services, because again, this is meant to be a permanent supported housing. It's not really meant to be just a subsidy program, that we are assessing that and encouraging folks to move on when they want to move on and when they're ready to move on. So important to keep in mind, again, moving on is optional for the clients, but not for the staff, right? So the clients can say, no, I don't want to move on, I want to stay here, and that's totally fine. No one's forcing clients to move on, but it is the obligation of the service provider to assess whether or not someone is, stable and may want to move on, and then to have those conversations with that participant, and if they're interested, to help them do all the things that would be necessary in order to facilitate that moving on, right? So applying for a subsidy, helping to locate another unit, helping them to connect to other service providers so that when they move on, they're still continuing to get any services that they might need. And then providing just some temporary supports during the transition. You're obviously not going to be able to provide ongoing case management to people who are moving on. That sort of would defeat the purpose, but just, checking in with people after they've moved on for a few months to make sure that they're stable and, provide them with some support and make sure it's working out and connect them to services if they need them. And then where there is no designated service provider, we realize that these things are not necessarily going to be doable for the LMHA, but to the extent that you are able to do these things, it's definitely moving on is so important because it helps us to reserve the slots in this program for the folks that are really, really, struggling and still out there on the streets, homeless. The more people we move on, the more people we can house. Okay. So we're going to break for a minute to take this little Zoom poll. And the question is, who is responsible for ensuring eligibility? So this is participant eligibility is documented. Shannon just launched the poll for us, and we'll give you a minute to answer the question. And then we'll share the results like we did before. All right, so it looks like we've got about half of our folks saying that it's the housing provider, about a quarter of our folks indicating either the CAN or the service provider. So we're going to look on the next slide at what the requirements are. All right, so initially, right, so there's a little truth in all of those responses that you gave, right? So so initially, right, the CAN is the entity that's responsible for determining whether or not someone is eligible before they refer that person to your project. But that in and of itself is unfortunately not sufficient. And this is one of the key things that we find over and over when we go out to monitor is that there's no follow-up after the CAN has provided those initial documents. So there are a couple problems with that. Number one is that the CAN may have made a mistake, right? So the CAN may have made a mistake in the initial eligibility determination, or the CAN may not have forwarded over all of the eligibility documents, right? Maybe they had them all, but for some reason they never got transferred all to you. This is the biggest recapture risk in these projects. I know I say that over and over and over, but we continue to see issues with this when we go out and monitor. So it really is incumbent on the housing provider, so that's what the guide says. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the housing provider has to be the one that does it. the housing provider can assign that responsibility to a service provider if that's what makes most sense for the project. But someone has to be responsible for not just taking what the CAN gives you and sticking it in the chart, but for actually looking at what the CAN gives you to make sure it's complete and it meets the HUD requirements. So in order to be able to do that effectively, the person who's doing that review really has to have been trained, because the requirements are pretty complicated. And we're not going to go through today what all of those complicated requirements are. We've done training on that a number of times, and the materials that are available on the website. And whenever you have a question about eligibility, please call someone on the CC BOSS team, and we're happy to help you answer that question. So the other big thing that happens, so one is that either the CAN made a mistake or that didn't pass along all of the eligibility documentation. The other thing that we find is this gap between when the CAN gathered the documentation and when the person actually entered the project, right? So HUD requires that eligibility be documented up until the day that the person entered the project, right? So if the CAN made the referral on January 1st, right, and now it's February 7th, when you get that referral, the housing provider has to make sure that that gap is filled. So if the person, for example, was in shelter for all of those months, for all of those days, right, you have to make sure that you go into HMIS and you print out that HMIS record that shows the entrance and exit dates for that shelter time. And that is, so that eligibility is documented up until the date that the person entered your project. The last thing that's on this slide is that it's so important to remember that HUD requires any kind of disability, right? That it meets the HUD definition of disability, and that's what the verification form is meant to do, is to certify the HUD disability. But because you guys are DMHAS projects, DMHAS requires that you go beyond that, and you also document that the person has a DMHAS qualified disability, right? So serious mental illness, chronic problem with drugs and alcohol, or HIV/AIDS are what the DMHAS criteria are. So you've got to make sure that the supplemental information is also in the file that shows that the person, in addition to meeting the HUD criteria, also has one of those types of disabilities. All right. So I'm going to cover this really quickly. There is a possibility. So let's say the CAN refers somebody to you, but you know, part of the eligibility documentation is missing, right? Like that the CAN just didn't pass it along, let's say. But you were at the CAN meeting and you know that if the documentation exists, you just have to follow up and get it, right? So in that kind of circumstance, you don't need to delay accepting the person. By all means, accept them and move them in so we get them out of shelter and off the streets as quickly as possible. You actually have 180 days under the HUD rules to get the required documentation. We really strongly encourage you to get it right away, because the longer it lingers, the more chance there is that you forget, and then HUD comes out to monitor and you don't have it. So that is a possibility. Use it judiciously. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about what to do, and I want to say that it's so great to see. Shannon and I have been, we've met many of you through monitoring. We've been out to monitor a lot of these projects, and it's very rare. We always ask every time to send us a list of all the applicants who have been referred by the CAN but not admitted in the last 12 months, and almost always the answer to that is, well, we don't have anybody, because we accepted absolutely everyone that the CAN referred to us, and that is so great to see. It's very different than it looked, back in 1999 when I first started working in CC BOSS. So you guys are really doing everything you can to accept absolutely everyone. The most common reason why we see that people were referred and not admitted is because either you couldn't find them, like that person disappeared, or occasionally because someone declined, the participant themselves decided they don't want to move in. So whenever that happens, or if there's another reason why you can't serve them, although that needs to be consistent with Housing First, that you notify the CAN. Obviously, if it's somebody that says they don't want to live at your program, right, you refer that household back to the CAN. And you do that in writing, right? So you provide the CAN and the applicant with the specific information that says, we're not admitting the person because they said, for example, they don't want to live here, right? and that you give them, if the reason that you're not admitting them is because you're not sure they're eligible, right, you give them specific instructions on what additional documents are required, and you give that again, both to the applicant and to the CAN. And for the applicant, you tell them who they can contact to get assistance and also how they can appeal the decision. We'll talk about this later, again, when we talk about termination, but it's really important that you do that thing about the, notifying people of the ability to appeal regardless of what the reason is that you're not accepting them, with the exception, of course, that they're deceased, which unfortunately sometimes happens. So in every other circumstance, including they declined the program, you should send them the information about how to appeal, because they may disagree. You know, you may say they declined and they said, no, I didn't decline. So we always want to give people the chance to appeal. Okay, so these are the things that are housing provider responsibilities when someone is initially certified. The first one is that they get a copy of the rental assistance certificate, and that should happen within 2 days of you determining, yes, they are eligible and we're going to admit them to this project. We almost always see the certificates in the state-run LMHA charts. I think that some of the nonprofit housing provider agencies are not using the certificate, and so you want to make sure that the participants are getting a copy of that certificate, because it has some really important information for the participants on it, and we want to go over that information with them. And that certificate, again, is at that link that we looked at before. You want to maintain a copy of that certificate in the chart. The RFA actually is something that I believe, and Alice, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the landlord's responsibility to submit that to the housing coordinator once the unit is selected. And then again, to try and make sure that someone is assigned to help the person identify suitable housing as quickly as possible. A lot of times that is the housing coordination, but sometimes it's not. It might be a navigator at the CAN, it might be the service provider, but it is the housing provider's responsibility to make sure that it's clear who is helping every person that's been issued a cert identify housing. Okay, so we're going to pause for a minute and do another quick Zoom poll. So this one, the question is, how many days does a participant have to find a unit? All right, so we've got about 75% of the folks responding up to 60 days with the possibility of an extension, and that's right, and we're going to look at those requirements right now. All right. So on the certificate, right, when somebody gets a certificate, it says that they have, 60 days to find a unit. I know some LMHAs tell people 30 days, try to light a little bit of a fire. I think that's fine. Alice, you'll tell me if you disagree. But generally speaking, the initial certificate is good for 60 days. And then you can do an extension for up to an additional 60 days. And I think usually what folks are doing, which is I think a good practice that OOC encourages, is for folks to do that 30 days at a time. And there is a spot on the certificate where you're supposed to document that extension, the date of the extension and when the extension is good until. And you really should reissue the cert to the participant when you do those extensions. Any extensions beyond those 60 days, right? So you've got 60 days initially, plus up to 60 days of extension. So it's basically 120 days total possible. Anything beyond that, you need to get written approval from Alice and her team before you do any extension beyond that. All right. HQS, Alice talked about this already. I'm going to move through this really quickly because we've got a lot still to cover. The guide requirement is that you complete the HQS obviously as quickly as you possibly can, because the sooner it's done, the sooner somebody gets out of homelessness, but certainly within 15 days of receiving the request for lease approval. You've got to re-inspect annually. There's a link here that both to the form itself as well as to the acceptability criteria, so what passes and what doesn't. And you want to make sure that the form is signed by the inspector, dated, because that's how we know that it was done annually, and that the unit matches what it says on the lease. That's a problem we see often when we monitor. And then finally, everybody that's doing HQS, really everyone that's doing HQS, because it applies not just to families with children under 6, but also to pregnant women, needs to do the lead-based paint visual assessment training. There's a certificate that you'll get after you've completed that training, and that has to be kept on file, and the link to do that training is here. All right, so these are the things that you have to do to approve the unit after you've done HQS. So you should notify the property owner, the participant, and the service provider, if that's relevant, of the inspection results. So either the unit passed or it did not. If the unit does not pass, you're going to set a deadline with the owner not to exceed 30 days. I mean, quicker is better, from the inspection date for them to make all of the repairs. And then you have to re-inspect the unit before you can do lease execution. Now, there may be some circumstances where re-inspection doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go back out, right? So you may, for example, let's say when you inspected, the fridge hadn't been delivered yet to the unit. You might, for example, have the owner text you a picture of the fridge in the unit so that you know that it's there without going back out. But we certainly don't want to lease a unit that we are not certain has a fridge, as an example. Okay, rent meter list, Alice talked about this briefly earlier. Again, you have to do 3 comparables. Some people are still only doing 1 comparable, so you want to make sure that you are documenting that at least 3 units of comparable size, comparable location, comparable amenities, etc., are renting at an amount that is more than or equal to the unit that you are assisting. So we still often go out and see rent reasonableness certificates where 1 or more of the comparables is less expensive than the unit that you're proposing to assist, and that is not allowable. The comparables have to be equal to or more expensive than the assisted units. And if you are, whenever possible, if you have a utilities included unit, you want to make sure that your comparables are also utilities included. Sometimes that's not possible because those are kind of special deals that you've been able to negotiate, and those units don't normally exist in your market. In that case, you want to adjust the rent for the utilities using the utility allowance to show that, yes, in fact, the one that we're assisting might be a little bit more expensive, but when you adjust the others for the utility allowance, in fact, the assisted unit is equal or less expensive. And the form is, again, that DMHAS wants to use is, again, at that link. All right, environmental review. Another quick Zoom poll here. All right, so how often must environmental review forms be updated? All right, so I guess this is a little bit of a trick question. So environmental review forms must be updated both when environmental conditions change and at least every 5 years. And we're gonna look at those requirements now. These are, again, these are not new requirements, but it's a place where we often see confusion. So this is a recapture risk. So we do need to make sure that all of the units have environmental review forms all units are included if it's a scattered site project on your environmental review form. Before you assist the unit, you cannot expend rental assistance dollars without environmental review. There's a ton of resources on the CT box website to help you guys get this done. And again, let us know if you have questions. One of the things that we commonly see is that the forms either are not signed at all by a responsible entity, or that the provider has signed off as the responsible entity, and neither of those things are permitted. The responsible entity is a unit of your local government. So what unit of local government is going to depend upon your locality. It might be the Housing Preservation Development Unit. It could be the Community Development Agency. But it's got to be signed off by someone in local government, okay? If you are unable to get your local government to sign off on your forms, you want to notify the field office, right? So Alana Cabell and her team there, you want to send them an email, right? So you've got documentation notifying them that your RE has refused to sign. They can then opt, if they would like, to send someone out from HUD to do the environmental review. I am not aware of that actually happening. So then what you should do, assuming that that does not happen, is send the form that you need to have signed to Steve Dillella at DOH, and he will sign on the state's behalf. So how often your responsible entity signs is up to your responsible entity. So HUD allows the responsible entity to sign off on a project-wide basis just every 5 years, right? So if you've got a scattered site project, right, you've got to add each unit that you're going to rent has to be included. So every time you rent a new unit, you're going to update the unit list that's attached to the form. You do not necessarily have to have the responsible entity sign off each time you do that, if that is your agreement with the responsible entity, but the responsible entity can require you to do that. I don't know why any responsible entity would. If I was the responsible entity, I would much prefer to only sign off every 5 years, but that's up to the RE. Okay. So if you are a congregate site, you do the CEST form, which is the more complicated form. And because the units are the units in a congregate site, you really only have to do it every 5 years, or if environmental conditions change. So that might be, for example, they built an airport next door to your building, or there's a factory across the street that, you know, is known, like there's been media out there that says that there's a toxic waste problem on that site. Those would be examples of environmental condition changes that you might know about. For scattered site projects, you use the CENST form. It's the less onerous form. And again, you've got to update that form each time you rent a new unit, just to add the unit list. Excuse me, just to add the unit address to the list, that's all. And then you've got to, again, redo the entire environmental review form, get it signed by the responsible entity again, every 5 years at least, or if environmental conditions change. All right, so these are the requirements that apply only in the 4 coastal counties in Connecticut. So we've got 4 coastal counties: Fairfield, New Haven, Middlesex, and New London. So if you are in one of those counties, the first thing that you have to do is to determine if the specific community where the unit is located is in a coastal barrier area. And there's a link to maps here where you can do that. And if those maps show that that community is in a coastal barrier area, then you have to go to this other U.S. government mapping feature, the Coastal Barrier Resource Mapper, and determine whether or not the unit actually is in a coastal barrier resource area. You cannot lease units that are in a coastal barrier resource area. So you've got to get a different unit. I actually don't think it ever happens. I think those units are in places that are either not developed or not affordable to our tenants. So I've not seen that be an issue. But you've got to make sure you've done the due diligence to check and that the maps are printed and attached to your environmental review forms. Okay, leases and half, I just need to, Alice, I think you're picking up here.
I am. Thanks, Lauren. So as I talked about earlier, DMHAS has a standard lease that's gone through the State Attorney General's office on and have housing assistance payment contract, and those are required to be completed. We would like the lease execution within 7 days of the HQS. So as soon as the apartment passes, we'd like you to, work on getting the client, the tenant housed. HUD requires for the first lease a 12-month lease, at least a 12-month lease. On renewal, they can be shorter. So I know sometimes landlords want shorter leases, or the tenant wants a shorter lease if they're trying to move, and those can be done. But really, HUD wants a 12-month lease, the initial lease. For DMHAS to be able to pay the landlord, we need a completed, legible W-9 form, an agency vendor form, which is about the landlords, a completed, accurate new admission summary. So that has to have the contract, the grant that it's coming from, the tenant's HMIS number. We need an owner assurance if in fact this is a renewal, that things have not changed. If the owner is asking someone to sign on their behalf, we need something that says that the owner is okay with that person signing. So if it's a partnership or a corporation, we need the partnership or that's okay, corporate resolution. We have the client's Bill of Rights that we would like in the file, the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, and the self-certification form if there is a reason the person is requesting the VAWA exceptions, the termination from the HEARTH Act documentation signed by the tenant, the releases of information, which should be specific to your agency, excuse me, the lead paint notice, even if the family or person is not under the age of 6, we still require that the lead paint notice is signed and that they're given information about lead paint possibilities, the Federal Privacy Act, and our grievance policy. Processing payments. There's a large section in the operations guide about processing payments. As I said, the federal W-9 form and the state of Connecticut agency vendor form need to be completed and legible for us to be able to process checks for landlords or direct deposit. There's direct deposit is the optimal option for landlords. Some do want paper checks, although there is the possibility, and this has happened before, of checks being stolen. So we really encourage direct deposit. And if you know that if it's a new landlord, you can send the W-9 and the agency vendor form to Nichelle Jefferson prior to sending up the contract. You can either email it to her encrypted or fax it. And that starts the process of getting them into the Connecticut, the core CT, which is the payment system. So to avoid delays, please look at page 38 of the guide. We're going to do a Zoom poll right now related to change orders. When are change orders required? So it looks like most people say when the household composition changes, followed by to stop a payment, to change the subsidy amount, and to obtain payment after HAP has expired. The truth of the matter is, the answer is all of the above. You could have chosen all of those, and those are correct. Lauren, can you switch to the next slide, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, Alice, I was talking again, but muted. So I just wanted to clarify, when the household composition changes, even if there's no change, like let's say a kid moves in or a kid moves out, as long as there's no change in the subsidy amount, would that require, I mean, it might require one if it's an adult and the rent calculation changes, but otherwise, would that require a change order?
No, the change orders really, yes, thank you, Lauren. The family composition, if it affects the amount of rent that the tenant is paying and the amount of rent that the state is paying, then a change order is required, but not if it's just, I don't know, a 17-year-old moved out for some reason. If that doesn't affect the income and the rental payments, a change order isn't necessary.
Yeah, so it could be like an adult that moved in that has no income too, right? That wouldn't require a change order.
So really the change orders, the best way to think about them is if there's any change to the HAP amount, the housing assistance payment amount. So if a person gets an income, a change order would need to be done because their rental portion would change. If a person loses income, a change order would need to be done to change, after a calculation worksheet is done, to change what their amount is paying. If a tenant moves out in the middle of a lease, a change order should be done to stop our payments. Once there's an active contract with the state, those payments are made automatically until the lease expires or till the contract expires. So if a person moves up, signs a lease on March 1st, we make a payment on March 1st, and they move out on March 20th, if we don't know about it, we will continue to pay for the entire year. We will then probably, in all likelihood, talk to the landlord about why they hadn't informed us of said move. But the point is, we need to, anytime there is a change in the portion that the state is going to pay, it needs to have a change order. The only exception is you cannot change the contract rent amount with a change order. So for instance, a landlord, there's a tenant, they're living in the unit, the lease expires, they had been paying, the total contract rent had been $850. The landlord doesn't want to sign a new lease, but wants to now charge $950. We cannot make that change with a change order. The tenant and landlord would have to sign a new contract and lease to make the contract rent change. So I just want to be really clear with that. Any other changes are made with a change order, such as the landlord is selling the property. You need to send a change order to stop payment to that landlord, do a new contract or contract amendment with the new landlord, and so the contract payments will pick up again. All of the information needs to be filled out according to what's on the W-9 and the agency vendor form, or SP-26. Building sales require a change order to stop payment we talked about. So if you have any questions related to change orders, you can certainly call us. I don't want to belabor the point here, but it really is imperative that we get notified of any changes. Initial payment and security deposit. The program will pay up to 2 months rent for security deposit unless the participant is older than 62. Connecticut state law states that landlords can only charge 1 month of rent for a participant or a tenant that is older than 62. Generally speaking, the way the process works is the security deposits are paid along with the first month's rent at the lease and contract execution. And so, based on the expenditures and how much We're trying to make sure that we have enough money to cover everyone in the program. We try to ask to have landlords only get 1 month of security deposit, but we understand that in some cases they would require 2. But we do ask that as you're looking at security deposits for people, to make sure that you have enough money in the grant to cover those expenses. Because the grant amount is only based on the number of units times the FMR times 12 months. So every security deposit that is paid is an extra month of rent or 2 that's taken out of the grant. Income determination in the rent calculation, as I said, income is required at least annually. If there is a change up or down of more than $40 per month, the tenant is supposed to inform the staff that there's been a change. A rent calculation is redone. If there's a change in the tenant portion, in the half portion, a change order would be done and sent to our staff to make the changes so that they're not overpaying or underpaying. And the tenant must be notified for 30 days in advance of any rent increase. The decrease takes effect that month, that we can retroactively pay a decrease. So if a person notifies you on May 15th that they've had an increase in their rent or in their income, you do a calculation worksheet, a change order, and the change would start July 1st. So you're giving at least 30 days notice, and you have to put in writing what their new portion of rent is going to be and when it starts. For those folks who have zero income, there is zero income, no income statement certification that they must sign. It is very important to have this signed, even if in their file. This is considered their income statement. And again, HUD requires annual notification of a person's income. So if a person says they don't have an income, we have to have the no income statement signed. And people should be aware of signs of fraud. It says we can suspend a voucher processing, but we'd really like you to contact us if you think that there's something nefarious going on, and we can kind of try and figure it out. You know, obviously you guys are not detectives, or, you know, you're not going to follow somebody around to see if they're going to work, but just, you know, make sure that because the person who's signing the no income certification is saying that they understand that they're signing this, and it's fraudulent if they do have an income and they're signing. And in the HERF termination, that is something that they can be terminated for if they're not telling the truth about their income. So the utility allowance, so the fair market rate is based on the base rent of the apartment plus all the utilities that a person has to pay. So if the rent is $800 and they have to pay, and there's an annual utility allowance sheet that is sent out. So for every size unit it is, what kind of utilities, and so you add the utilities that the person is eligible for to the base rent to get to the FMR. For all of the utilities that a tenant pays, those have to be deducted off of their 30% of their income. So if a person is 30% of their adjusted income is $200, and the utility allowance is $150, that the tenant is responsible for, you subtract 150 off the 200 to get $50 for the person to pay for rent. Income documentation, again, has to be provided at least annually, and it is a condition of the participation. along with doing an annual HQS. So those are the two things that have to be completed annually: an income verification and the housing quality standards. So documentation of their income is copies of pay stubs, copies of their Social Security benefits, copies of alimony if they receive it, copies of not SNAP benefits, TANF benefits, anything that is a cash income. And cash income is what is counted towards the person's rent portion. So SNAP benefits are not part of the annual income. Tenants need to, in the calculation worksheet, all the tenants that are participating in the rental assistance program get the $400 disability deduction. People can ask to see their calculation worksheet. It is the responsibility of the housing provider to work with the tenant to understand what their portion is and why. And again, it's really, and we base the portion of rent on the person's gross income, not their net. So, you know, we all know we have taxes and other kinds of things taken out of our pay stubs. But if we were to do a calculation worksheet on our own income, it would be on the gross income, not the net. And as I said, people need to get letters saying what their portion of rent is and when it's going to start. So, you know, housing provider or service provider, if you can, is to assist the person with move-in. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean you guys have to rent moving trucks and those kinds of things, but if there's a way you can help, refer them to things that are available to help move them in. Assist again with furniture or household goods, not that you or your agency has to supply those, but if you know of resources within your community to refer people to those, and document your due diligence. The annual notification. So the annual recertification notification, the housing provider is required to send the participant 90 days before the end of the lease the forms that need to be completed and returned with an envelope so that they can return them. You can try and schedule your time and date of your housing inspection that way, or you can talk to the tenant in person and over the phone and, you know, work out a time that's agreeable. Work with the landlord about the fact that you're going out to do an inspection. There might be issues that need to get remedied and they would have 30 days to fix those. And then if there are issues that needed to get repaired or fixed, you have to go out, in most cases, go back out and do, I think, as Lauren said, if there's, you know, if you can do a photographic evidence of the repair, but you just want to make sure that whatever the repair is, it was done within the 30 days. And keep copies of all of these things in the client's chart. We talked about the annual inspection. We have to do a rent reasonableness determination annually. Again, I think Lauren mentioned it earlier, and I know I did. You have to have 3 comparable units. And they have to be the same neighborhood, the same, relatively the same square footage, etc. So those have to be done annually. The environmental review Lauren talked about, the income determination and rent calculation, the new lease and HAP, and then all of the payment stuff that we need to ensure that people can the landlords continue to get their payments. If a person wants to move to a different unit, which is acceptable, particularly in the tenant-based apartments, the project-based and sponsor-based, those units are generally tied to the building. So unless there's an option for a tenant-based voucher to be given to a tenant, they can't take those subsidies outside of those buildings generally. But if a tenant wants to move, we ask that a change order be done, terminating them from their current apartment, their current unit, so that we don't continue to pay, even if the lease has expired, just to make sure that we're ending that agreement with that landlord. The new apartment needs to meet the HQS and the rent reasonableness. It needs to be located within the CT BOSS and project service areas, except in the issue of domestic violence. Or we have had instances where tenants want to move into a different continuum of care, and we do work with the other continuum of care in locale to try and figure out the best way to have somebody move. It's just a little trickier, but it can be done. The participant must provide written notice to the housing provider and to the landlord or owner that they are intending to move. We also ask that the housing provider send a 30-day notice to the landlord, because we have an obligation to pay our portion of rent, and so we want them to know that our portion of rent is also stopping. If the move is before the end of the lease, there has to be an agreement between the landlord and the tenant, agreeing that having the landlord agree that he's letting the person out of the lease. The exception, of course, is the domestic violence and the VAWA stuff that we would do. Speaking of, here it is. The VAWA emergency transfer allows persons who have experienced domestic violence, and that is, although the term is the Violence Against Women Act, it should be Violence Against Partner Act, because it really is, or not even just partners, but it is really about ensuring domestic violence, whether it's man against woman, woman against man, man against man. You get my drift, I think. And it's really to allow them to move into another unit to provide safety to the person who had experienced the domestic violence. We work really, we've worked really closely with HUD on various issues related to this. It's just there is a form that needs to be looked at. There's the CT BOSS policy, so everyone can look there. And it is our goal to help people move as soon as possible to get out of a situation that is not safe for them. I think Lauren's gonna.
All right, I think I'm picking up here. Thank you so much, Alice. Okay, I'm going to move pretty quickly because we're a little behind, so bear with me. I'm also probably going to skip a few things that are less important, I think. So housing stabilization services. So, you guys are not the lease police, right? So the owners are responsible for lease enforcement, right? Not the service provider. Service and housing providers are responsible for helping participants to understand and comply with their lease. Among the things that DMHAS is requiring and that we'll look for when we monitor in terms of housing stabilization services is that you are meeting with participants where there is a designated service provider. This is that service provider is meeting with participants in their apartments at least once in the first 30 days of tenancy and at least every 6 months thereafter. More often as necessary, as is always the case. If it's somebody that is really unstable, you definitely want to get, certainly if it's someone, for example, who's collecting, hoarding, but you definitely want to get in that unit much more often than that. So this is a minimum requirement. And then just to clarify, this is a place where I think we see a lot of confusion. That health and safety checklist does not need to be done twice a year. It needs to be done approximately 6 months following HQS, right? So every HQS has to be done once a year. That's a much more onerous process than the health and safety checklist. About 6 months after that, you want to get in that unit and do the health and safety checklist. That's one of the forms that's been updated, and we definitely still see the older version of that form that really has your case managers rating how clean someone's apartment is, and we really want to avoid putting the case managers in the role of being the cleanliness police. And so that form has been updated and really just addresses true health and safety issues, not cleaning. You know, how people's standards for what is clean vary widely. It's very subjective. So please, if you are still using that old form, go to the website and get this new form. Okay, eviction. So obviously, owners, right, landlords, can only evict through court action, right? Eviction is a legal process. They have to go through court to evict. The owner is required to notify the housing provider at the commencement of any process to terminate tenancy. And of course, always we encourage that there are negotiations that happen to avoid formal eviction whenever possible, because the more times people are evicted, the harder it makes to rent them units. I don't have to tell you guys that. Okay, so we're gonna do another quick Zoom poll here. Participants who are evicted need not be terminated from the CoC rental assistance project. True or false? Okay, so we've got about 75% of our folks responding true and 25% of our folks responding false. And the answer here is true. Just because someone is evicted, it doesn't mean that they have to be terminated from the project. And we're going to talk about that now. All right. So, you know, the goal here, right, is to get people housed, obviously, help them stay in that housing. But where there needs to be multiple attempts to house someone before the person is able to stabilize. And so just because someone is evicted doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get terminated from the project. You can certainly, and are very much encouraged to, continue to try to work with the person and to rehouse them, you know, and that can happen multiple times. There's not one set standard that says you can only rehouse them once after eviction or twice. You can continue to work with them and continue to try to rehouse them. And even where the eviction is going to result in a termination, so then that doesn't mean that the person can't again reapply. The problem is if they reapply, they're probably not going to meet eligibility. And so until we move over to the dedicated plus, which I'm not going to get into now, they're not going to be eligible. And so that's really why we want to continue to keep them enrolled and rehouse them rather than to terminate them from the program. And we're going to be talking a lot more about Dedicated Plus. We'll do a training on Dedicated Plus. If you have questions on that, we will answer those questions, we promise, before that gets launched across the state. Okay, so preventing termination, obviously we want to help keep people in their units and avoid having them get terminated from the program. I'm not going to go through all of this because we are short on time. I am going to just point out that it is required when there is going to be, you know, someone is going to get terminated, someone is going to lose their housing, but as soon as it looks like someone is at risk of returning to homelessness, you make a referral to the CAN. The CAN will convene a case conference, and we've seen some really great problem solving happening through that process that enables people to either retain their housing or to get quickly rehoused if retaining the housing is not possible. All right, you do need to make sure that prior to commencing a termination from the program, if the participant gets a written warning letter, you've got to cite the specific reasons, and those reasons should refer back to that harsh termination document that Alice was referred to before. And you want to instruct them that they should reach out to the housing provider immediately to discuss how to correct the issue and make sure that they don't lose their housing. You want to make sure if the person has a case manager, that the case manager is copied and that the letter is maintained in the chart. So other things to keep in mind when you do actually have to terminate someone, obviously you can't terminate them for a reason that's not consistent with Housing First. You've got to notify the CAN that they're being terminated, and you've got to make sure that the participant gets a formal written notice that says that they're being terminated, why they're being terminated. Again, this refers back to that hard termination document that you made them aware of when they first joined and every year when they recertified, right? We reference back to one of those rules that were violated. You've also got to make sure that the letter includes the right to appeal and includes a list of advocates who are available to help them with that appeal should they want help with the appeal. When there is an appeal, it's got to be the person who makes the decision on the appeal cannot be someone who is a subordinate of the person. It can't be the person or someone who's a subordinate of the person who made the original decision. So if you were involved in the original decision, you have to recuse yourself from the appeal. And then once the appeal happens, the person has to get final written notice. So oftentimes the problem that we see here is either programs aren't doing this at all, or more often they're doing it, but not in every circumstance. So you really need to do this termination requirement every time there's an appeal. The only exception is if the client is deceased, right? So even if you don't know where the client is, you send this notice to the last known address. If the person had their mail forwarded through the post office, they will presumably receive it. You are required to send it in every circumstance, including because the person is moving on to a Section 8 voucher, right? So in that case, you would want to say, hey, congratulations on getting your Section 8, right? We're no longer going to be paying your rent, but you've got to give them the right to appeal, because there might be a disagreement about whether or not, in fact, they got approved for Section 8 or whether or not they want to move on. So again, you always have to give the right to appeal unless someone is deceased. We see this often, so you also have to include, this is a HUD requirement, you also have to include both the VAWA notice of occupancy rights and the incident self-certification form with that appeal notice. So you should, the letter itself should indicate that those are enclosures, and those documents should be enclosed with the notice. And then, as Alice said, you've got to do the change order. And the housing provider, the LMHA or the nonprofit housing provider, has to make sure that all of these requirements, that these have been met, are documented in the person's chart. So I think, Alice, were you going to do this next one? I think you're doing this next one.
Yes. Yep. So thanks, Lauren. I did not realize I didn't have myself on mute, so I hope I wasn't making the weird noise.
No, you weren't.
So, as Lauren said, anyone has the right to appeal. That, as Lauren said, that includes people moving on, that includes people who are incarcerated. Obviously, it's a little harder to do it if you're incarcerated, but they do have that option. And so there is a process. I'm going to go quickly through it. So the informal conference with the CAN, again, the person who is running the program should not be involved in that meeting. They need to, recuse themselves. If the CAN makes a decision that upholds what the termination, there's a second level, which is a 3-panel hearing at the DMHAS level, and then there's a final review also at the DMHAS level. And so, the person has the opportunity. The person also has the opportunity to have advocates with them, including attorneys if they so choose. And so, we try to make sure that everyone knows all of their rights, and that we really uphold all of making sure that someone's rights are not being infringed. Vacancies and retention of assistance. So if assistance continues to a maximum of 30 days from the end of the month in which the unit was vacated, unless it's occupied by another tenant. So if a person moves out on May 15th, and there was not an agreement that the person was going to move out on May 15th between the landlord and the tenant, we would still need to be required to pay up the the month of June's rent in this example, because we have to give the landlord 30 days notice that we're stopping our payments. When a participant is in an institution, which is incarceration, hospitalization, a nursing home, anything which has them out of their unit for more than 90 days. So if a person's out for less than 90 days, they do retain their apartment. But if it's 91 days or more, we would, the assistance could be terminated. If a person is part of a household, so meaning they, more than one person lives in the apartment and the head of household passes away, the remaining family can stay in the unit until the lease and contract expire. The difference is if a person is a single person and passes away, the landlord should tell us that that has happened, or the service provider should tell us that that has happened, and we would, give our 30 days notice and end payment. So I just want to be clear that, if it's a household and the family stays in the unit, it's up to the end of the lease or contract. But if it's a single person, we do not pay beyond that 30 days. Property damage, again, the Continuum of Care Rental Assistance Funds can be used to pay an amount that does not exceed 1 month of rent for damages that a participant has done. This should be limited to a one-time cost. So, a tenant can't, destroy an apartment. We give the landlord the rent, the property damage, the tenant moves, there's damages in the second apartment. We technically don't have to give the property damage payment for 1 month to that second landlord. And it's only when the tenant leaves the apartment. So if the landlord says, Joe put a hole in the door and I want you to pay me extra money, that would be paid either if out of the security deposit, or if it exceeds the security deposit, it could come out of the 1 month of the rental assistance. Who is responsible for ensuring full expenditure of project funds? That's another poll that we're going to do. So here it is up on the screen. Is it CoC staff? Is it the housing provider? Is it the service provider? Or is it both the housing provider and service provider?
All right, did you want me to pick? I think I'm picking up here right now.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got a couple folks that think it's the CoC staff's responsibility, a couple folks that think it's the housing provider's responsibility, and the bulk of folks responding both the housing and service provider's responsibility, and that is correct. So we really need both the housing providers and the service providers to be involved in making sure that the project is fully expending funds. This is super important, and we're going to talk now about what the specific responsibilities are. So DMHAS is regularly sending out that spending tracking report. So that's a great tool. I think it's helped us to really reduce the amount that we're underspending significantly. We really do not want to send any money back to the federal government. So that's what happens when we don't spend it. So every dollar that we send back is a dollar that we could be using to get someone out of homelessness. And so that DMHAS tool has been a great step forward, but it's not the solution in and of itself, right? So you guys really need, the housing providers and the service providers really need to be looking at that tool and updating it with the most current information that you have available. And if the data don't look correct to you, you need to be calling Alice and her team. Tell me if it's someone else they're supposed to be calling Alice to figure out where the disconnect is. And so as soon as you see the thing about underspending is that the sooner you realize it's happening, the more time you have to correct it. Because once you get close to the end of the fiscal year, your opportunity is gonna close. So you want to determine what's causing the underspending, and then take action to correct the underspending, working with your partners as quickly as possible. I'm not going to go through all of these things because we are running out of time, but I do want to say that you guys have done great work on this. We are really making progress. We are not quite there. We are still leaving some money on the table, and so our team at CC is always happy to talk to you guys about what options are available to you to correct the underspending. A lot of this now is happening in the congregate PRA projects, which have more limited options, and Alice and her team are working with our partners across the state to look at a solution for those projects as well. So more to come on that. And again, if you have questions, please call us. All right, so we're going to talk really quick. Yep, go ahead.
I wanted to interject about the overspending and underspending. It's really a tightrope walk. You really have to, make sure that you're not on target to overspend either, because then the state picks up that overspending, and that's also not great for us. And so I just want to be, really mindful that, we send out the expenditure report. We have you enter stuff into HMIS. There's a tracking tool that Bo Anderson has created. It's really, really important to track all of that. And if you, in the expenditure reports, see things that we send out monthly, you see things that are in error, immediately contact us, because, we're working with over 2,000 participants. So sometimes things do, things get coded wrong, and we just want to so let us know as soon as that's why we send out the expenditure report, ask you to review it for accuracy and completeness every single month. So I just want to put a plug out there for that.
Thank you, Alice. Okay, so we're going to talk really quickly about monitoring. We did recently do an entire webinar just on this topic, so really encourage people to go. If you weren't a part of that webinar, it's recorded and up on our website, so please go check it out. We're not going to go in depth into monitoring today. We're just going to talk about how we're going to handle the new requirements that were implemented through the guide in 2020 when we monitor projects in 2020. So DMHAS certainly recognizes that projects need time to implement the new requirements. So there's no expectation that all of those new requirements are implemented when we come out in 2020. But we do want to help you guys to identify where changes are necessary. So we will note in the report where there are changes that are necessary to meet the new requirements, but we will also note that the requirement is new, right? And so that, again, no expectation that all of those things are miraculously done the day, of course, the guide is released. Okay, so we want to spend a few minutes talking about where you guys can get more information. Because as I said in the beginning, this was a quick overview, mostly of the things that were new in the guide, and unfortunately, there are 1,000 or more than 1,000, there are tons and tons of rules associated with this funding stream. And so the principal federal requirements are the CoC program interim rule, which is basically the main set of regulations that define the requirements for the program. All of the fiscal requirements, the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards, right? Those are available at the link that's shown here. And then HUD also releases tons of information through what they call notices. And so there's a whole nother set of requirements that are layered on top of the regulations that are issued in the form of notices. And so all of the notices are available here. Now, whenever HUD releases a new notice that's relevant to you guys, the CT Boss team makes it our business to review that notice and get information out to you guys, because the notices are long, they're hard to follow, and we really want you guys to be spending your time helping people get housed and stay housed and not reading thousands of pages of HUD documents. So don't worry, we will let you know when the requirements change. But sometimes people really do want to go straight to the source, right? You don't want to take our word for it. You want to go straight to the source. So if that's the case, please, by all means, feel free. Everything that we use, you know, to help you guys understand what the rules are and follow the rules are all publicly available documents. So you're always welcome to go straight to the source and see for yourself what all these different rules say. Okay, layered on top of all of those federal rules are all of the local requirements that are established either by your CoC, so CT-BOSS or ODFC, or there is now the statewide CAN policies that were established by DOH. There is the statewide rapid rehousing model guidelines that were also established by DOH. There's the rental assistance operations guide that we've been talking about today. And then there are also, for the CT-BOSS YHDB projects, there are also requirements specific to those projects. All of these things are available on the CT-BOSS website, and I presume that for the things that are CoC specific, comparable documents are available on the ODFC website if you are an ODFC and not a CT-BOSS project. So again, we do not want you guys spending all of your time reading all of these voluminous rules. And so what we have done is we have compiled all of the most important rules into the monitoring guide. So a good place to start is to make sure that you have the monitoring guide, you're familiar with it, and that guide is available at the link on this website. So the guide also specifically cites each place the basis for each of the requirements, right? So if it's a CoC program interim rule requirement, it'll give you a citation in the interim rule, and you can go directly to the interim rule and read what it says. Similarly, if it's an operations guide requirement, it'll say there that this is established in the operations guide, and you can look in the operations guide to find out more. There are also resources to all of the links to all of the resources that we talked about today, like the HQS forms and the web-based paint training. All of that stuff is also embedded in the guide. So we've also got up on the CT-BOSS website guidance for what should be in each of the participant charts. So if you haven't checked that out, please check that out, particularly if you're about to get monitored. That would be a good thing to look at, or after monitoring when you're trying to correct any of the findings. We've also got up there links to a ton of other resources that are available to you guys. And of course, Alice and her team convenes meetings quarterly with all of the CoC rental assistance providers. So we really encourage you guys to attend those meetings. I think those are super helpful. It's a great place to bring feedback and also to get your questions answered. And then finally, we want to make sure that if you are a CT-BOSS project, that everyone that should be in your project that needs to keep up to date about all of the business of the CoC is registered for the HUD grantees email list. So it is your responsibility when staff change over, you've got to make sure that the new staff go to the CT-BOSS website. There's a link right on the homepage, and that you register for the HUD grantees list. Otherwise, you're going to miss key information and you're going to miss deadlines, right? If you have staff turnover and you haven't gone there to update who the contacts are, you're not going to get key information. So that's really important. All right. So I think, unfortunately, as I suspected, we are out of time. Again, if you answered a question in the Q&A and we did not get to answer it, please just call me and I'll be sure to answer your question. It looks like maybe there's one there that we didn't get to. I think that's going to be away as soon as I stop broadcasting this webinar. And anyone else that also has questions that didn't get answered today, please call either Alice or I. We are going to send, Shannon on our team, on the HI team, is going to send out an evaluation. So please fill out the evaluation. It'll be a SurveyMonkey, super quick. You do it right online. We will also get both the slides from today and the recording posted to the CT-BOSS website within the next couple of days. A couple people asked how they can get a copy of the slides. I think people should have gotten a copy emailed to them with the final reminder, so you can check your email. You might already have a copy, but if all failed, go to the CT-BOSS website and they will be available there. Anything else you want to say, Alice, by way of closing?
No, I think that about sums it up. I really appreciate everyone's time. I know, 2-hour webinar is a lot to dedicate. And for that last question, as Lauren said, call one of us, both of us. If there are other questions that were not answered, we are available to, respond. And I think the last slide is our contact information. So that's great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.